Okay, I hope you all had a good time in our port of call yesterday. We're keeping our fingers crossed for the Falkland Islands. Yeah, hopefully. So we've talked about this being a historic voyage and some of the famous adventurers who've made this voyage before us. And this morning we want to talk about one of the greatest, Sir Francis Drake. Drake, who said, "Disturb us, Lord, when we are too pleased with ourselves, when our dreams have come true because we have dreamed too little, when we arrive safely because we sailed too close to the shore." So Drake had a fascinating career as a seaman, a privateer, admiral, knight of the realm, and politician, and he sailed along the route we are sailing right now. So let's first talk about Drake as a seaman. He was born in 1540. He was the oldest of 12 sons of a Protestant farmer who would later become the farmer. His dad would later go on to become the vicar of a church in Medway, England. Drake was apprentice to a neighbor who was the master of ships that were used for the coastal trade. And the neighbor was impressed with Drake. And eventually, when that man who owned the ship died, he willed his ship to Drake. So Drake was married twice. He had no children. 1563, he made his first voyage to the Americas with his cousin, Sir John Hawkins. The Hawkins family owned a fleet of ships, and Drake sailed on his cousin John's ship. In 1583, he made his second voyage to the New World, again with Hawkins. This time they were trapped by the Spanish in Mexico, and all the Hawkins ships were destroyed. Both Drake and his cousin managed to escape with their lives, but Drake at that point vowed that he would take revenge on the Spanish. So he made two more voyages on his own. We really don't know much about those. But after his two successful voyages on his own, thirsty for revenge, Drake becomes a privateer. So what's the difference between pirates and privateers? Well, pirates are thieves, privateers are sanctioned thieves. But sometimes the lines between the two, the legal, i.e. the privateer, and the illegal, i.e. the pirate, sometimes those lines get a little blurred, as they do with Drake. Now, prior to the UN or any international law, if countries had grievances against one another and they were competing for control or something, they really didn't have many alternatives short of going to all-out war. So privateering was kind of a covert operation that countries could use to resolve differences or at least nip at the heels of the country that they had some grievance against without going to all-out war. So letters of marque and reprisal were issued, allowing the ships of one country to attack ships of another country that was flying a particular flag. Not any ship of any country, but only ships of the specified countries with whom their home country had an issue. So let's say you guys over here are the Dutch, you are the British, and you are the Spanish. Okay? You have a letter of marque and reprisal to attack English ships, but only English ships. You can't go after the Spanish. Usually it was the Spanish and the English that were going back and forth. And so that's how this whole thing worked. In return, the privateer would get a portion of the goods he seized, usually about 50%, and usually 50% went to the crown. The privateers had immunity from the country that commissioned them, which didn't think of them as thieves, but as heroes. And they were prisoners of war if they were caught. And sometimes, in the case of Drake, they ended up being rewarded greatly, and in Drake's case, even being knighted back at home. Now, there's some doubt if initially Drake was really a fully licensed privateer, that is, with a letter of marque, or if he was just a freelancing guy, that is, a pirate, when he would attack his country's enemy, but really for his own personal gain. But Queen Elizabeth saw the privateers as a way to continually nip at the heels of the Spanish shipping and encouraged a group of men who she called her sea dogs to go out and raid Spanish shipping. And the queen gave them money and ships, and then part of the treasure they brought back went to the queen. And that's what Sir Francis Drake was. 4 years after being captured in Mexico by the Spanish, Drake plots his revenge. Now with a letter of marque and reprisal from the Queen, he aims at the heart of Spanish territories and the riches in the Americas, and he sails for the Spanish Main. The Spanish Main is that lucrative coast along the Caribbean Sea where all the jewels and silver and gold, all the riches of the New World were passing through there on their way back home to Spain. So how it worked is that all the gold, silver, and gems collected, say, from Peru, would come up the western coast, come into Panama City, which was then the richest city in the world, and then from Panama City, all this treasure would be loaded onto mule trains, sometimes mule trains 150 mules long, and they would make the trek through the jungle, over the isthmus, to the Caribbean side. So many people died along the way that trail was called the Trail of the Crosses. Sometimes these mules that were loaded down with silver and treasure just fell off the mountain, giving rise to a lot of rumors today that there's hidden treasure someplace out in the jungle. Sometimes they fell along the way. Sometimes, being Panama, they just simply disappeared. That stuff happens today with treasure in Panama. Sometimes it just disappears. Nobody knows where it went. So there's still rumors that because that original trail actually followed pretty close the route of the Panama Canal today, there's lots of rumors that someplace under the canal there's all this treasure that's got lost. And so when they dredge the canal, everybody's hoping to find interesting things. And they have found interesting things, not treasure, but actually come up with old skeletons and all sorts of old things that have come up along the way. So the treasure would then be taken over to the Atlantic side to a place called Nombre de Dios. That's where Columbus first came ashore, and he called it Nombre de Dios. And there it would be stored in these big treasure houses to await the arrival of the Spanish treasure fleet. Every year, 2 fleets left Spain loaded with European goods that were in demand in the Spanish-American colonies. Those 2 fleets sailed together down the coast of Africa. They'd stop at the Canary Islands for provisions before the voyage across the Atlantic. Once the 2 fleets reached the Caribbean, the fleets separated. One fleet went to Veracruz in Mexico. There it went to board the silver porcelain shipped from China on the Manila galleons and brought overland from Acapulco by mule train. The Tierra Firma fleet sailed on to Cartagena, Colombia, to load up on South American product. Then others went to the island of Margarita off today Venezuela to load up on pearls. And finally, they went up to Panama to places like Portobello and Nombre de Dios to collect the silver, gold, and other treasure. Most of that treasure actually came from Peru, came up the western coast into Panama City from Peru and then across to the Atlantic side. So then when from there they would sail home through the Caribbean, and when you get back to the Spanish Main, one of the important reasons for all those forts along the way, forts like El Morro in Puerto Rico, were to protect, to give the Spanish a presence there, to protect this fleet going back, carrying all the treasure back home to Spain. So the arrival of the treasure fleet in Panama and when it left to return home to Spain, they were big momentous events. So in 1572, with a crew of 73 men and 2 small vessels, Drake manages to capture this little town of Nombre de Dios and its treasure. But in the fighting, Drake is wounded, and to save his life, they decide to withdraw, and they leave the treasure behind. Drake stays in the area, recovering on board his ship, meanwhile, as they can, raiding small-time shipping and hoping to capture another treasure shipment. A year later, Drake joins forces with a French pirate to capture a mule train with 20 tons of silver and gold. But the mule train is seized out in the middle of the jungle, so they had to get all this treasure back. So Drake's men buried most of the loot, taking along only what they could carry. That has given, of course, rise to stories of buried treasure. The French pirate is wounded, he's captured by the Spanish, and he is beheaded. But Drake and his men managed to escape, carrying what little they could. They slogged 10 miles over the mountains, through ravines, across rivers, in the jungle, to where they had left their raiding boats, only to find out when they got there that their boats were gone. So exhausted, hungry, and with the Spanish hot on their heels, they buried the remaining treasure on the reef, on the beach, and then they built a raft to sail 10 miles along the coast back to where they finally found their ship. Back on board, seeing a worn and bedraggled Drake, the crew was worried and discouraged. But Drake laughed, he ripped open his shirt, and there, in true South Florida fashion, on his hairy chest, he had a great big, heavy gold chain. And he said, "Our voyage is made, lads." Just the value of that chain was enough to pay for their voyage and give them some money. So what Drake is best known for, and what ties him most closely to our voyage, is Drake's voyage around the world on a ship that eventually will be named the Golden Hind. Using his connections, Drake managed to get approval and support from Elizabeth I. With 5 ships, Drake set out on a mission for the Queen, destination unknown, but with an almost certain aim to attack Spanish shipping and interest wherever he found them. When they sailed from Plymouth, no one but Drake knew the real purpose of the voyage. And the real purpose of that voyage was to sail around the world, claiming territory for England. Sailing along the Portuguese coast, they nabbed another ship. Now they had 6. And as was customary in these kind of voyages, those ships carried 1 clergyman acting as a chaplain and a number of gentlemen adventurers who had paid to come along. Generally, these guests paid for their own voyage, and they went for a sense of adventure, and the ship took them on board to provide companionship and conversation with the master of the vessel. But once in a while, these guests, as guests sometimes do on ships, they like to throw their weight around. And this is the story of the problem passenger. So following the same route we're taking from Rio down the coast, headed for the latitude where Magellan had crossed into the South Atlantic, where we're headed, they encountered some rough seas. And one of these gentlemen adventurers decided that he and the other gentleman should have some more say in the itinerary. They questioned the way the captain was running the ship. They may have felt, and probably did, that Drake was socially inferior to them, and they resented him giving them orders. So Drake, as captain, of course, did not agree with this, and this particular problem passenger didn't know when to shut up and began preying on the fears of simple, uneducated seamen that they were sailing into unknown waters with all sorts of unknown problems, and it was going to be very dangerous, and they probably all would be killed. And he was told to keep quiet, but the problem passenger, Thomas Doughty, kept pushing. So Drake ordered him to be tied to the mast for 2 days as punishment. Stoically, Doughty accepted. He managed to twist the incident, however, to his own favor. And as the ship neared the area where Doughty had convinced the uneducated crew that they were going to perish, Magellan's men almost mutinied. Drake's men almost mutinied. So Drake knew that he had to do something to maintain his authority. So he called a trial, and it was a trial by jury. And the jury found Doughty guilty of refusing authority and trying to subvert the voyage. Drake decided that the penalty for the crime was death. But Doughty kept right on complaining that Drake did not have the authority to put him to death, blah, 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 blah. So the night before the scheduled execution, Doughty made his confession. He and Drake took communion together, very nice. And then in true gentlemanly fashion, they had dinner together and seemingly had a cheerful discussion. Doughty asked Drake that the executioner strike clean and fair, for I have a short neck. And the next morning, they went ashore on an island, and Doughty was beheaded. Don't complain too much. So Drake had been over-ambitious in collecting additional ships, and the problem he faced was that he simply did not have enough seamen or crew to take all these ships around the Cape. So 3 of the ships were broken up and just discarded, and the original ship, the Pelican, now renamed the Golden Hind, led the way around the Cape. Since no ship had ever returned back eastward around the Cape, once they rounded the Cape, the crew then realized that they were going to be sailing around the world. Drake had discovered a new way around the Cape, the way we're going to take, which was an alternative to the more difficult Straits of Magellan route. So now the path that we are taking is named Drake Passage in his honor. The Pacific, despite its name, was more like its typical self, wild and dangerous, and one of his smaller ships, the Marigold, actually sank along the way, and 29 crew members were lost. As the two ships struggled north, searching for shelter, the second ship, the Elizabeth, had had enough of Drake, and so they simply deserted, turned around, and sailed back through the Strait of Magellan for home. The Golden Hind, now alone, sailing up the coast of Chile, stopping at small settlements along the way to bargain for supplies, pick up gossip about the Spanish. The gossip was very important to Drake because that's how he knew where ships were, they had been, and heard the rumors of what was coming. So whenever Drake saw a ship, he just took it, he plundered it at will, mainly for supplies and provisions for his own ship, but he really didn't have enough crew members to take on another ship. So he ended up abandoning these ships as he had taken them and just ripping them up and leaving them there. Then he had the kind of news that he really was looking for. Drake got wind of another ship, Nuestra Señora de la Concepción, that was part of the Spanish treasure fleet that was around Lima, Peru, on its way to Panama. This was what he was looking for. Nuestra Señora de la Concepción was Drake's most profitable score. Drake captured a Spanish ship laden with 25,000 pesos of Peruvian gold, amounting in value to 37,000 ducats of Spanish money, which is about $11 million by modern standards. He took 80 pounds or 36 kilograms of gold, a gold crucifix, jewels, 13 chests of royal china, 26 tons of silver. And then, in a very gentlemanly gesture to his fellow seafarers, he dined with the captured ship's officers and gentlemen passengers, offloaded them with gifts appropriate to their rank, and a letter of safe conduct back home. But now Drake had the problem of he had all this treasure. How does he get it back home? Now, having ripped off a major Spanish treasure ship in Lima, Drake thought it was probably a good idea to steer clear of Panama. So after stopping in Guayaquil and Huatuco, he headed to North America, landing in what is today called Drake's Bay, to haul out his ship, careen her bottom, and make repairs to the masts and rigging. Amazingly, in the fog, he would miss San Francisco Bay entirely. Nevertheless, one of the greatest old hotels in the U.S. would eventually be named in his honor. We believe that Drake put ashore just north of San Francisco in what is today called Drake's Bay in Point Reyes National Seashore. Were he and his crew to land there today, they might be very surprised at what they find. because it is a well-known nude beach. But at least it gave California the distinction of, although not being a Spanish territory, although being a Spanish territory, gave it the distinction of being claimed by Drake for England in 1579. Drake missed San Francisco Bay, but he's not the only famous explorer to miss discovering the great jewel. Verrazano did the same thing in New York. He failed to sail up what became the Hudson River, and Cook did the same thing in Australia, missing what is today called Sydney Harbor. Drake made repairs to his ship. He had a very good encounter, a party in fact, with the local indigenous people. He named the place where he landed New Albion, and this is an engraving by Theodore de Bry, published in 1590, showing Drake in California. He sailed further up the California coast to the Oregon dunes and then headed out into the Pacific, missing the Hawaiian Islands, but taking 66 days at sea. 66 sea days. No entertainment. No buffet. I mean, can you imagine that? We got 3 days and I got to see land, but 66 days. So eventually they got to the fabled Spice Islands. They load the already heavily loaded ship down with spices, and unfortunately they run into a reef, and the ship is stuck fast on the reef. They unload as much as they can, throwing over the spices, throwing over chairs, furniture, everything except the Spanish treasure, and the ship still doesn't move. So they call on the ship's chaplain to pray. Now, a lot of these ships had chaplains on board. Drake and Fletcher, the chaplain, have an interesting history because after the execution of the gentleman adventurer Thomas Doughty, the good Reverend Fletcher preached a sermon in which he criticized Drake's decision to execute Doughty. Not a good idea. So Drake had the good chaplain then chained to the hatch cover as punishment, and then solemnly excommunicated him. Not that Drake had the right to do that, but he did, okay? But now he needed divine assistance. So he called on the chaplain. Prayer meetings weren't the usual crew activity on board, but Fletcher agrees to pray. But first he insists on calling upon every crew member to repent of their sins, including Drake, and bringing up the question once again of the execution of Thomas Doughty and Drake's need of repentance for that act. Now, God must have been pleased with the good Reverend, because before Drake could tie him once again to the hatch cover, there was a sudden breeze that miraculously carried the ship off the reef and set them free to sail onward. It's an interesting, fascinating story. But Drake was not done with this guy, and he was kind of thoroughly pissed with him. So once again, Drake had crossed the line in questioning the master's judgment. So Drake called the ship's company together. Once again, he excommunicated Fletcher, and Drake forced him to wear a name badge reading, "Ye falsest knave that liveth," around his neck for the rest of the voyage. So if he was on a cruise line, this is what his name tag would have looked like. So the ship made its way around the Cape of Good Hope, stopping at Sierra Leone, finally made it back home. Due to internet problems on board his ship, Drake had no way to keep up with the news from England. So Drake's first question when landing was, "Is the Queen alive and well?" And she was. Now, not only was he probably genuinely concerned for his queen, but had she died or been dethroned, and were there a new monarch in place, there might be a whole new policy. The new ruler might have questioned some of Drake's activities, even had him imprisoned or beheaded. But fortunately, his queen was still there. So in 1580, Drake returns to Plymouth with 59 men, enormous wealth. And that wealth is to be split with the Queen. The Queen's half share of the cargo suppressed the rest of the Crown's income for that entire year. And in gratitude, the Queen gave Drake a jewel with a state portrait in miniature. This was an unusual gift because you have a queen giving a commoner like Drake this beautiful, beautiful gift. On the other side, there's a double cameo of a regal woman and an African male. The Drake jewel, which you see here in the painting of portrait of Drake, the Drake jewel is now on display at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. Now, the Queen had declared that all written accounts of Drake's voyages were to become the Queen's secrets of the realm. And Drake and the other participants of his voyages, on pain of death, swore to their secrecy. No emails allowed, regardless of where the server was located. The Queen intended to keep Drake's activities away from the eyes of the rival, predominantly Spain. Now, one of our passengers reminded me of this the other day, that one of the greatest treasures that Drake had seized from the Spanish was what were called the rudders, or the books, the notes of the ship's pilots, what routes they had taken, where the reefs were, where the good passages were. Those things were incredibly valuable in an age when nations were struggling and fighting and competing for control. So that's why the Queen wanted all of this stuff kept top secret. Now, Drake ended up being a very wealthy man, 1580, through intermediaries, because the owner of this property couldn't stand Drake. Drake managed to purchase Buckland Abbey, a large manor house where Drake lived for 15 years until his final voyage, and it remained in his family for several generations. Drake goes on to become a politician. He becomes mayor of Plymouth and eventually a member of Parliament. Queen Elizabeth I awarded Drake a knighthood aboard the Golden Hind on April 4th, 1581, as carefully recreated in tons of paintings and memorials. The only problem is that the actual dubbing, the actual knighthood, was not performed by the Queen herself, but by a French diplomat who was negotiating for Elizabeth to marry the brother of the King of France, the Duke of Anjou. So it wasn't just that she was too busy at court or didn't want to expose any of her lavish outfits to the salt air, but it was primarily a political move. And by getting the French diplomat involved in the knighting, then Elizabeth was gaining the implicit political support of the French for Drake's actions. During the Victorian era, in the spirit of nationalism, then they promoted this story and the image that she had actually gone aboard the ship and she was the one who actually knighted him. Actually, she knighted him, but the ceremony was never performed by her. With Spain having declared war on England, the Queen ordered Drake to lead an expedition to make a preemptive strike on Spain's colonies. And that expedition became known as the Great Expedition, so taking Drake back out of being a politician, taking him back to the sea. Drake left Plymouth in 1585 with 21 ships and 11,800 soldiers. He first attacks Vigo, Spain. Then he plunders Santiago in the Cape Verde Islands. He attacks Santo Domingo, and he ends up capturing Cartagena. On his return trip, he stops and he raids, for good luck, St. Augustine in Florida, and then sailed north to Sir Walter Raleigh's settlement at Roanoke, where he replenished them with supplies, and then he took home some of the original colonists who wanted to head back home to Britain. Knowing that Spain was planning to invade England and assembling a fleet at Cadiz, in 1587 the Queen sent Drake to attack. Drake manages to destroy much of the Spanish fleet at Cadiz. He seizes and destroys supplies. He raids forts along the coast, and he seized another treasure ship. All of this delayed Spanish plans to invade England by more than a year, but it didn't really change the plan or dispel them. Her order to the Queen's order to Drake was to singe the beard of the King of Spain. So in 1588, Drake is appointed Vice Admiral of the British Navy. Just like the image of the Queen knighting Drake on Golden Hind, there's probably an apocryphal story that Drake was actually playing a game of bowls, as shown here, when word came of the approach of the Spanish Armada. Drake is supposed to have remarked that there was plenty of time to finish the game and still defeat the Spaniards. So the Spanish Armada was a fleet of 130 ships that sailed August 1588. They sailed with the purpose of landing an army to invade England. The strategic aim was to overthrow Queen Elizabeth herself and the Tudor establishment of Protestantism in England, with Spanish privateering against England. So it was a multiple campaign. Number one, we're going to invade, then we're also going to do privateering against all the English fleet and the places along the way. Drake is a vice admiral at this time. He's in charge of the English response. He met with the Spanish fleet in the English Channel. Based on good intelligence, he found out that one of the ships was carrying the payroll for the invasion army. So he was able to seize that ship, seize the money to pay all the troops. And Drake's ship was leading the English pursuit with a lantern in front. During the night, he extinguished the lantern, so the Spanish had no idea where the English were, if they were still there, if they'd left, or what the hell was going on. And that was part of Drake's plan to create anxiety and disarray within the Spanish fleet. During the night, then, the English set fire ships into the fleet, causing the majority of the Spanish captains to just break formation, flee, sail out into the open sea. And this is the popular image of the defeat of the Spanish Armada. And yet there was still another battle to be fought the very next day. In the ensuing battle, the Spanish fleet was damaged and forced to abandon its rendezvous and invasion plans. The Armada managed to regroup and, driven by the north-southwest winds, withdrew north, and the English fleet chased it all the way up the east coast of England. The commander ordered a return to Spain, but the Armada was disrupted during severe storms in the North Atlantic, and of the initial 130 ships, a third of them failed to return home. Now, unfortunately, things did not end well for Drake. 1589, the year after defeating the Armada, Drake and Sir John Norris were ordered to seek out and destroy all the remaining ships, to destroy Portuguese rebels against the Spanish king. Variously known as the English Armada, the Counter Armada, the Drake-Norris expedition. It ended up in a colossal failure. They managed to destroy a few ships, but in the process they lost 20 of their own ships and 12,000 men. Not only was the English fleet defeated, but the Spanish victory marked a revival of Philip II's naval power, and that would last through the next decade, and it served to deplete the crown treasury that had been so carefully restored during the long reign of Elizabeth I. Drake's seafaring career continued into his mid-50s, but without the same record of success. 1595, he failed to conquer the port of Las Palomas, and following a disastrous campaign against Spanish America, he suffered a number of additional defeats. Then he unsuccessfully attacked San Juan in Puerto Rico, and eventually he lost the Battle of San Juan. The Spanish gunners from El Morro Castle in San Juan had shot a cannonball through the cabin of Drake's flagship. He managed to survive, but a few months later, January 1596, he died of dysentery while anchored off the south coast of Portobello, Panama, where he had given chase to some Spanish treasure ships that had sought shelter there. Before dying, Drake asked to be dressed in his full armor. He was buried at sea in a lead coffin near Portobello, actually very near where we will be sailing next month as we exit the Panama Canal. Divers continue to search for the coffin but have never found it. Drake was 55 years old when he died, a respectable lifespan in the 1500s, particularly for a man of war. Following his death, the English fleet withdrew. Drake had his revenge on the Spanish. He helped really to save Britain from speaking Spanish, and he was an explorer, an adventurer, became the first English person to complete a circumnavigation of the globe, and he was captain and leader throughout that expedition. We might all profit from his words. Disturb us, Lord, when we are too well pleased with ourselves, when our dreams have come true because we have dreamed too little, and when we arrive safely because we sailed too close to the shore. So that is Sir Francis Drake, amazing, amazing hero who sailed down the same coast where we are right now. Coming up, hopefully after the Falklands, I'll be talking about Chile and our first port calls in Chile, and provide some scenic commentary, cruising commentary, as we make our way around the Horn. So guys, thank you very much for coming this morning. Have a great day on board. Keep your fingers crossed for the Falklands. Stay put for Steve's photography lecture. I'm anxious to see his penguin pictures. I know he went out to take some, and I'm anxious to see what he came up with. So thank you very much, guys. Have a great day.